Thank you, Carrie. And it's so nice to see everyone joining us. So as you're coming into the room, feel free to introduce yourself into the chat feature. I believe that we might have a few others joining us along the way. So thank you to Healthcare for the Homeless for having me, and obviously to AC3, Alameda County Care Connect, for the opportunity to bring this training to you, which we are here to talk about trauma-informed care with the perspective of recovery and healing as well. You know, just as Carrie introduced me, but also just to put that out there that I wear both hats of trainer and consultant in integrated healthcare, as well as a clinician myself. So a lot of the topics that we'll be talking about, I might, you know, be bringing in some of my own experiences with working with clients, and I welcome you to do the same. Okay, so let's just go ahead and get ourselves settled, and just a reminder about the presence that we have here. This is your opportunity to learn. This is your workshop, so I'd love you to make it what it is for yourselves, to remove any distractions, putting your phones on mute if possible, also putting your own videos on mute, or your link on mute. There will be plenty of opportunities to unmute yourself, so I do want you to get familiar with that function as well. Make sure you're comfortable with beverage, snacks, whatever you need, note-taking materials. We're here to talk about trauma, and so if some of the material feels a little too close to home or feels like it's you need to take a moment, please do so. Take a breath, take stretch breaks as you need it. We don't have a formal break, but I want to encourage you to do what you need to do to be comfortable. And just a setup for virtual learning, which I assume a lot of you have been on these meetings or gatherings or other trainings before, but you know, you have a mute unmute function, and there's usually a bar that's at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen. Again, there'll be opportunities to unmute yourself, so to get familiar with that. There's the video function to actually show yourself, and you know, while we're in the course of the training, to the extent that you can show yourself, that would be great, especially when we go into breakout rooms. If you can please show yourself so that you can work in the context of the group and everyone can see you. You can also see who's on if you're interested, and use the chat feature. So do get familiar with that feature as well, because we'll be using that a lot during the course of our time together. We also have a few polls that I'll be launching, and I'll talk you through those. And then as we do the small group breakouts, I'll also talk you through how to enter into those. So that's sort of like the overview of our whole virtual learning experience here. Here are our learning objectives for our time today. So I do want to go through types of trauma exposure, the trauma continuum, the impact of trauma, toxic stress, and then talk about some interventions that will help with healing and recovery. To do that, I've sort of broken us up into 3 sections. We'll talk a little bit about some of the prevalence and the statistics, but then go into definitions. What is trauma, and then move into the interventions. And then I also want to talk about organizational trauma-informed care, and you know, have the lens of how do we do this from a systems perspective as well. Let me just stop there and just check in. And are there any other things that you want to kind of make sure get touched upon? How are the outlines sounding to you so far? And you can feel free to put yourself chat function. Okay, cool. All right, so let's talk a little bit about trauma, and a little bit here locally, as well as I'm going to bring this out to the national perspective as well. So these are some statistics that have come out, you know, the caveat here being that our statistics are older than where we are now. So this information comes from 2019. Obviously, the world has changed so much since then. now that we're in September 1st, 2020 here. So this, in terms of the census population and count, this was a point in time count that was done in 2019 to capture people who are homeless. And so in 2019, we saw approximately 8,022 individuals who were classified or described as persons who are homeless. And then of those, you can see on the right side of your screen in Alameda County, there were some subpopulations that were accounted for. So those that were chronically homeless, veteran populations, and then unaccompanied youth and young adults. Because we don't have the current statistics, at least not that were readily available online, these obviously may have shifted, and a lot of the work that you do has probably shifted these numbers since there's been a effort towards housing people, especially during COVID-19. But just to sort of take a look at, where we are with some of the numbers here and what might jump out at you. So to take that a step further, here's another look at among those 8,000 or so individuals who were described as homeless. Here is the array of health conditions, if you will, that were reported. And I just want to stop here and ask you, what might be jumping out at you? What might be surprising here? Anything speaking to you? Any trends that you're seeing per se? And you can write them in the chat function and or unmute yourself. Yeah, all of these are related to trauma in some form. Absolutely. Yeah, so, what we see is that no matter what has happened in a person's life, whatever that trauma might look like, it has impacts, right? And the impacts are showing up in these categories, if you will, and that's kind of the way statistics work, is that people are categorized. But we see kind of a lot in terms of, mental health and substance use disorders here. I would think the percentage for chronic health problems would be higher. Yes, of course. And also just to point out, there's a little note on the slide that people were able to respond to multiple questions. So we're seeing kind of a spread of all types of conditions, if you will. So there's a little bit of skewing with the data here. Right, there might be self-medicating, so coping mechanisms, absolutely. And then, yeah, as mentioned, emotional and psychiatric conditions are super high. And I just want to go back, I did see a couple recommendations. So covering generational trauma, yes, we will talk about that. And then trauma stewardship, yes, how we are affected by trauma ourselves. We are absolutely going to cover that and go through some of the types of things that we as caregivers, in any way, shape, or form, caregivers experience with trauma, exposure to trauma. So thank you for those additions. So yes, again, so we're looking at some of the statistics here and sort of what's coming out to us. So let's look a little bit more at violence and trauma in Oakland. This comes from the Urban Strategies Council, which did a summit in 2019 on violence and trauma, and they called it the Safe Oakland Summit. They had about over 500 people participate in surveys, focus groups, and interviews. And this was sort of kind of what they came out with. So, if we're thinking about the latest data, regardless of what has happened this year, this was the status as of last year for the 500 or so individuals that they surveyed. Again, anything here jumping out at you? Oh, and by the way, there's acronyms on here. So CSEC stands for Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children. GV is gun violence, and DV is domestic violence. So, my takeaway here is that over half of the population has experienced some type of violence or trauma. And this is probably not necessarily new information, but just sort of to show kind of the types of things that people are experiencing, and as they're called violence or trauma. Now, these could be single incidents or they could be repetitive incidents as well. So that's something that often doesn't get captured in the data either. So moving this out to the United States, this, I believe, comes from 2014. A few years ago, looking at prevalence of trauma for adults and for children. And I'm really curious to see what speaks to you here. Because when I looked at the slide, I was like, wow, this is really eye-opening to me. Especially the first one, where 98% of female offenders have experienced trauma, interpersonal and domestic violence among adolescents. Yeah, really high percentages across the board, absolutely. And it's an eye-opening experience to kind of look at some of these numbers, and then to think about, like, how do we best support people and think about the types of trauma that people experience and the after effects of that. So let's move into what is trauma, right? So we're going to kind of talk about the types of trauma and how we define different things that people experience in their lives. I would love to give an opportunity, because I know so many of you are working with individuals who may have experienced trauma, whether they're your clients, your consumers, or even among the people you work with or people you know. What are some aspects of trauma that you would call out? Like, how would you define trauma? And feel free to just like throw those into the chat function and or unmute yourself. What are some components of trauma that might be part of how we describe it? The feelings of being scared, anger, confused, hypervigilant, irritable, depression, paranoia. Thank you, Elizabeth. Yes, activates the fight, flight, or freeze. We're going to talk about that. Recurrent, withdrawn, anxiety. Absolutely. So these are all kind of the things that people experience when trauma has occurred, whether it's in the moment or whether it's part of a person's history. So let's talk about a definition. And then just adding, Melissa added, gaslighting leads to confusion, questioning ourselves. Yeah. So our role in how we interact with people as well. So here's a definition of trauma. This comes from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And it offers a framework for understanding the complex nature of trauma. So in this definition, if you will, individual trauma comes from an event or a series of events or circumstances. And then there's an experience that people have, usually from an emotional or life-threatening perspective. And then we have the multitude of effects, right? And effects that land on all the different levels of a person's being, their functioning, mental health, physical health, social health, emotional health, and spiritual well-being. And many of you touched on these aspects in terms of the feelings and the emotions that people carry. So if we take that a step further, our past influences our current behaviors. And so basically what this means is that, and hour means global hour, but what happens in life at any point in time has a relationship to how people and ourselves function and show up currently. right? So there's always a trajectory and there's always a life history that plays a role here. And also what's really important is that the word trauma is nomenclature, right? We use the word trauma because that's kind of the current word that is out there right now to describe all the different multitude of things that people experience. Yet for people, for individuals, what they go through may not be described. They may not have those words, right? They may not use the word trauma. They might use the word, I had a bad night, or I had a rough experience, or I had a bad childhood, right? And so it's really important to pay attention to the words that people use and to ask people to expand on those when and if they feel comfortable. And that's the other important point about trauma, is that it's always up to the individual for when they are ready to share what they're ready to share. We can't force it. And it's only up to each individual to be able to describe what has happened to them and what is important to them. And, you know, keeping in mind that also for people that experience abuse at a very young age, they might not actually have the words to describe what happened to them because the understanding of what happened is still unclear. And also that memory might have been impacted. And so remembering the details might also be difficult. So allowing people to use their own words and their own vocabulary for sharing is super important. So if you remember from that definition of trauma, there were 3 E's that were called out. There were events, there were experiences, and there were effects. So events are typically things that are outside of ourselves. These are things that are in the environment or environmental things that happen that cause trauma. So think of things outside of the person and the being that cause trauma. Then there's the experience, right? So the experience is going to differ from each person to each person. For example, 2 people can be in a car accident, and one person is able to get up and walk away and be completely fine. Another person has, you know, feels the experience has impacted them to such a degree that it impacts them that day, that later that month, maybe years later. So the experience is always going to be different in terms of what a person takes away from it. And then the effects, of course, are also going to be broad. So the importance of sort of the holistic framework from which we engage and understand symptoms and behaviors, because it's not only just the symptoms and behaviors, but it's the context of, you know, how people are able to live a quality of life and a satisfying life as well. So events, experience, and effects, and we're going to talk about these a little bit more. So let's start with events. So we can categorize events in potentially these 3 categories: abuse, loss, or chronic stressors. So tell me, in terms of abuse, what are some types of events that can fall in this category? Just name some types of events. Go ahead and put those in your chat or unmute yourself. What are some events that take place in people's lives that might be categorized as abuse? Physical abuse? Emotional and mental abuse? Verbal? Great. Mental, financial, verbal, sexual abuse? Yep. Great. So, oops. Witnessing abuse as well. So you guys, you touched on pretty much all of these and witnessing potentially domestic violence or experiencing domestic violence. We might add bullying in here. Neglect, I like that you added that as well. Abuse can also come from institutional or systemic places as well, and we're going to be talking a lot more about that. Also being in a chaotic environment, absolutely. So now let's go to the next column here. How about loss? What could we categorize? What are events that might take place that signify loss? Mm-hmm. Death, loss of loved ones, mm-hmm. Separation, loss of family ties. Yep. Loss of your parents or caretakers, particularly if they've been incarcerated, abandonment. Great. So again, you guys touched on most of these, even loss from a natural disaster or being displaced, accidents, terrorism, war, loss of housing, absolutely. Being kept from what you love and are used to, loss of community connection, yes, all falls into this category. And keeping in mind also that loss to one individual is different than loss to another individual. So we might think of the loss of a home or a loss of housing as a loss, but to other people, it might be something that they're used to, right? Or something that they grew up with, and it's just part of their comfort level, if you will. Thank you for adding in other ones, loss of health or loss of self-care, thinking about the individual. And then finally, chronic stressors. What are some examples of chronic stressors, events that cause chronic stress? Pandemics, living on the streets, overthinking, lack of housing, loss of a job. Yep. Yeah. Chronic health problems. Thank you for adding that in there, because having chronic health problems can be an ongoing chronic stress. An example of that is like living with HIV, for example, can be a chronic stressor in some people's lives. Toxic relationships. Thanks, you guys are adding some really good ones. Here's some other ones. So thinking kind of more on a broader level of chronic stressors that can occur. Prejudice, discrimination, racism, homophobia, etc. Right? We're seeing all of this play out right now. Even medical procedures, right? So while there are some things that are well-intentioned and necessary, the medical system has a way of being abusive and traumatizing to many people. We're going to talk about historical and community trauma in just a few moments. So just to put those out there, and that, it could be group and community based as well. And then you mentioned health conditions. So yeah, a lot of different things that in terms of events and how we can think about how they get categorized. Let's move on to the experience of trauma. So the second E is experience, and experience is affected by how, when, where, how often trauma occurs. So for example, trauma that is a single event might be called a single episode trauma, or acute trauma, if you will. Other people have experiences of repetitive trauma, which is ongoing, chronic, prolonged, and overwhelming. Example of this might be, someone who's experienced repeated sexual or childhood abuse. Add into that, there's another type of trauma called complex trauma, where we take repetitive trauma and then add in the interpersonal relationship, the family dynamic. And then developmental, right? So early on in life and the impacts that plays out. So how, when, where, and how often is going to be unique in each person's experience of trauma. Factors that increase the impact might be things the earlier it happens, because remember, the earlier in life, people don't necessarily have the memory or the words to put together what has happened. When people might be blamed or shamed for what might have taken place, and this is often a common feeling that people carry, shame or guilt for what has happened. One of the most important things that we can do when we're working people is to let people know that what happened was not their fault. if people have been ignored, silenced, disbelieved, maybe even if the perpetrator was someone they knew or someone they trusted. And so again, another important thing is allowing people to share their stories, and allowing people to share what has happened to them, their own narrative, and to be heard and to be validated. Thank you, Lola, for adding in another type of trauma and the impacts of trauma that we're seeing playing out right now, for sure. The Black experience of living in America, yes, is absolutely traumatic as well. So effects of trauma. So the effects of trauma, again, are going to be individualized, but they might be conceptualized as something that we might understand. So in a behavior that we might understand, because it's a response to something that has happened that, that has overwhelmed a person's system. So we might call it a normal response to an abnormal behavior, right? So for example, if someone has been abused early in life, and then as a teenager, as a coping mechanism, starts to drink, right? We might say that that's an understandable response to a painful experience that a person has had. And it's the only way that they know how to really cope or even dissociate from what has happened. What are some other justifiable or understandable responses that you might see in your clients based on the effects? Right? We're not judging it. We're not saying it's right or wrong, but that there are things that people might engage in, do, have behaviors of, around, that we can understand because of what has happened to them in their life. Having distrust, feeling isolated or disengaged, holding anger, frustration. Yeah, absolutely. So to kind of think about that again from the holistic perspective, wanting to hurt people who hurt people. Yeah, so almost in a sense of, revenge, or wanting to take on the ability to hurt others who have hurt their loved ones. But we think about from this holistic perspective of all the different effects of that trauma can take. There are physical aspects, there are emotional aspects of the effects of trauma. You've named a lot of these. Someone also named, in terms of physical, eating and sleeping disturbances, right? We might have additional pain. So people are experiencing and reporting more pain because of trauma experiences. Behavioral, we might see some self-harm and or other coping and other behaviors, isolation. Cognitively, so the effect on brain development, and we'll be talking about that in just a few moments. And then spiritually, like how a person feels about themselves, how they hold themselves, how they engage with or not engage with other people, maybe even questioning one's own purpose, if you will. So a lot of different effects. And again, to think about how we engage with people from a broad range of interventions and from an individualized approach and perspective. So let's talk a little bit about historical and intergenerational trauma. So this is a type of trauma that impacts groups and communities. And it has this aspect of psychological wounding because it's comes from the experience that one has had in their own life, or the experience of a group of people and living out that experience, or even living with others, growing up with others who have lived through that experience. And the stories then get transmitted across generations. The coping and adaptation responses become transmitted across generations. It gets like in the DNA, if you will, within that group or that community, and it carries across generations. So there's a deep cumulative emotional and psychological wounding. And usually what happens, especially with historical trauma, is that I'm going to take a moment because my my Wi-Fi was just showing me it's unstable. Hopefully it's back now. So historical trauma, the aspect of it is that there's usually some piece of unresolved emotions. It could be grief, it could be anger, it could be repressed feelings. But this accompanies the trauma and contributes to effects like what we see, the physical, behavioral, cognitive, spiritual ways that people, that shows up on the person or the group, if you will. And within the United States, we know that this is associated with racial and ethnic populations who've suffered really great intergenerational losses and assaults on their culture and well-being. Here's an example from a Japanese internment camp on your screen here. What are others? What are other types of historical trauma? Yeah. And as you're thinking about that, one adds the healthcare system, right, and society perpetuates trauma by labeling people. Yes, absolutely. The words, the vocabulary, the categorization of so many individuals, and then people like living from that, like living from the fact that they're being called disabled, and then they live their life from that perspective. It's not fair, and it's also traumatizing. So I wish these labels could be replaced too. Oops. Yes, other examples of historical trauma is Native Americans being forced into reservations. We heard earlier the effects on the Black or African American communities, and racism, slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration of people of color. Yeah. So there's lots of examples of different ways that that groups, communities, and individuals have been perpetually and historically been traumatized. Yeah, children in cages, that just makes my heart sad to even read that. So, and it's currently going on, right? So what's happening currently in the world and in the United States, and what's being called out? We're making history by traumatizing people right now, and the impacts that that's going to have on people, future generations, is just a little scary. Yeah, thanks for adding some more in here. Great. So trauma is contagious. Trauma is transmitted through relationships. And we're also going to talk about how relationships can be healing. But just to sort of emphasize the point that many of you are making is that trauma can be passed on through individuals, families, communities. They go through generations, even in utero. There's a whole side of work that's being done on the toxic stress and the impact of transmitting trauma from mother to infant. They're passed on through power dynamics and discrimination, even to consumers, and then they're passed on to you. So you as caretakers, as caring professionals, as helping professionals, as care managers, trauma can come onto you as well. Just going to read what Lola had added. I feel like what's happening to Black people in America is actually internally traumatize the Black family unknowingly. And then we pass this trauma from generation to generation. Yeah. Through our lack of expectations. Yeah, that's a really important point. Thank you for adding that in there. The impact that it has on the way people show up in the world with future generations. So I think a lot of you are thinking about this now, and I want to give you the opportunity to kind of have a discussion with each other. This is going to be our first group breakout. So Jackie, I'm signaling you in the background. We're going to put you into small groups, and we're going to look at probably groups about 4 or 5 here to answer these 2 questions. How does trauma show up in your work? And what are some of the words that people use to describe experiences that we might call trauma, right? So what are some of the vocabulary or the words that you hear coming out that people are using that might, not be classified as trauma. All right, so we're slowly welcoming everyone back to the main room, and sorry if you may have gotten cut off with your conversations. We just wanted to give you a few moments to have some time to speak to each other about your own experiences. Just wondering if there might be one or two individuals that would like to share any thoughts to these questions before we move on.
Hi, this is Robbie, and our group, we had a common thread in the lack of trust based on previous experiences of the client having had gone through, and just really not trusting the system, maybe being behind the 8 ball before we even begin. Words like nobody believes what I'm going through, I don't trust the system, and I'm invisible, I'm alone in the world. And we kind of had a common thread there.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. That's sort of the theme that is pervasive through a lot of the people that you might work with or be exposed to their backgrounds.
I think there's a lot of institutionalized trauma, whether it's incarceration or foster care. There's systems that are set up and people feel like they're set up for them to fail. Some of the other words people use, they feel hopeless, helpless, resentful.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so that institutional systemic aspect of what people are dealing with, and then the words and the ways that they describe that, or the emotions and the feelings that they have around just loss of power, if you will, to do anything different. Thank you for that. Okay. All right, I'm going to move us on to talk a little bit more about trauma exposure. And to do this, we're going to actually go through a few definitions of the types of exposure that people, especially you as caretakers, can be witness to. And then I just want to acknowledge what Juan added, like working in a shelter, looking in their eyes, seeing lost souls, broken spirits. Yeah, same with people in the streets, right? So the effects of how people are managing and dealing with, right? We're seeing just loss, feeling of being lost. Okay. So we're going to go through some definitions of trauma exposure, and I'm going to do this through poll feature. So I'm going to pull up a question, and then it's a definition. So tell me what you feel that this relates to. So having emotional residue of exposure from hearing trauma stories and becoming witnesses to the pain, fear, and terror that trauma survivors have endured. What type of trauma exposure is that? Is that secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, secondary victimization, or emotional trauma drain? Giving you a couple more seconds to let everyone vote. Now, if I can ask you to put yourselves back on mute. There's a little bit of, yes, thank you. There's a bit of background noise. Okay, so we have the answer for the most part is vicarious trauma, and second to that is secondary traumatic stress. So the answer is actually vicarious trauma. So carrying the emotional residue of hearing the trauma stories is known as vicarious trauma. Okay, so now let's go on to another one. So what do we call indirect exposure to trauma through a firsthand account or narrative of a traumatic event? Is that secondary victimization? We just answered vicarious trauma, so you know it's not that one. Is it trauma stress, toxic trauma, or secondary trauma? Oops, did I launch that for you? Sorry. So indirect exposure to trauma through a firsthand account or narrative of a traumatic event is what type of trauma exposure?
Secondary.
All right, looks like you guys got this. So indirect exposure to trauma and hearing firsthand accounts is called secondary trauma. So there's, subtle differences to the different definitions here, but I thought it would be helpful to kind of lay out the terms a little bit for you. Let's do another one here. So what is emotional and physical exhaustion leading to a diminished ability to empathize or feel compassion for others? All right. Okay, looks like you guys got this too. So this is known as compassion fatigue. So when we carry the exhaustion and it diminishes our ability to even feel compassion in the first place. All right, here's another one. How about this one? Feeling emotional duress that results when a person hears firsthand accounts of a trauma experiences, especially multiple experiences of many clients. So just a reminder to put yourselves on mute, please. All right. So, yeah, so the answer is actually secondary traumatic stress. I made up the trauma exposure fatigue, but I feel like that was the appropriate way to describe it as well. So again, it's not so much about, knowing the exact definition, but exposing you to the different types of stressors that and the impacts that people are talking about in terms of how it plays out for you. So when you or others as caregivers are hearing firsthand accounts of others, and especially multiple stories and the accumulation of those, that's called secondary traumatic stress. Okay, I think we have one more. Oh, sorry, I don't think we've done this one yet. A way of victim blaming. So blaming victims for attitudes, behaviors, and practices that can result in additional trauma to the client. So if we were to get to a place where we're saying something like, well, you asked for that to happen to you, and that's a form of victim blaming, what type of trauma exposure is that? Yeah. Okay, so yes, many of you got this. So this is secondary victimization. So when we get to the point, this is a place of burnout for sure, but we get to the point where we're thinking, you asked for what happened to you, or you caused what happened to you. We may not mean it, but that's sort of the judgment or the feeling that's going on because we've been so exposed. And we may be working with someone who we might feel, we're normal, we're human. We might be working with someone where, they're just stuck in the same situation over and over and over again. Okay. I think I have one more for us to go through. Yeah. Okay. So what's this? This one is having emotional or physical or mental exhaustion caused by excessive prolonged stress. This occurs when you feel overwhelmed, emotionally drained, and unable to meet constant demands. Okay. Yeah, looks like cool. I'm just going to share the results because I think a lot of you are on the same page here. So this is burnout. So when you feel that emotional, physical, or mental exhaustion because of the prolonged interaction and or work-related feelings of overwhelm, emotional drainage, and unable to meet demands. So again, just a way of bringing in the different types of trauma exposure that exist and different definitions around that. So you can see sort of the subtlety of how these all play out and how they all affect you and others as caregivers or caretakers. So these were all the definitions that we went through. But what I kind of want to just point out, we don't necessarily need to know the ins and outs of all those definitions, but trauma exposure in general is this emotional residue that any caretaker, whether they are counselors, care managers, case managers, care coordinators, frontline workers, helping professionals, this is the emotional residue for having to work with people and hearing the trauma stories, being witness to the stories, the terror, the fear, and it's your state of tension and preoccupation because of those experiences. So what I want to say about this is that trauma exposure is real for helping professionals, and also it's for helping professionals, they're more likely to get to a state of burnout because of the trauma exposure. So in general, burnout can happen in most industries. People can get tired and overwhelmed from the work and the overwhelm and the constant projects and the demands. Burnout happens in a lot of industries, but for the most part, people can quit a job or change their work and lessen the effects of burnout. But for helping professionals who are in the state of hearing many trauma stories over and over again, burnout comes a little bit quicker. And so just to be aware of that and to be kind to yourselves around that and to understand how you're being affected by all of this is really important too. And the importance of your own self-care plays in here too, definitely as well. So we're going to come back to this in a few moments to talk about different types of interventions, not only that you can do for yourself, but that you can encourage your clients to do as well. But I want to move us on a little bit more to talk about brain development and trauma. So, oh, and actually I should stop a second. Anything that want to share or mention at this point?
I wanted to share something, and I did it as a chat. Like some of us, probably a lot of us on this training have been through years of working with clients who have trauma. We've been exposed to really horrific things that most people are not used to being exposed to. And some of us have even tried self-care, but I think some of this goes beyond just, meditate and, do this, that, and the other thing, because it's so intense, some of the things that we see. We work with the homeless here. We almost always go to encampments and we see really difficult things. And I'm just curious about the overall, what can we really do? Sometimes I think there's nothing you could do. You just have to store it away because we're seeing it every day, and it doesn't go away really. That's my issue about, I love doing it, but I think there's a price you pay when you do this every day for years and years and years. So that's I don't know if that's a question to you or a comment, but in hearing other people, they've gone through the same thing. So I'm just curious. It's not just like meditate and, relax and all that, because that doesn't cut it sometimes. So
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that up. This is Shalom that's speaking.
yes.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And I do want to acknowledge that the work that you do is, first of all, it's so critically important. And I know that you know that. And I hear that you enjoy doing what you do and you have an expertise in it. Yet also there's the side of it that how do you effectively take care of yourself so that you're not affected by it in the long term? And I hear you when you say that things like doing meditation and breathing is not the answer to it, yet that is sort of, I mean, not that itself, there's a lot of different techniques that you can do as well, sort of this, but it's more about like mind-body integration in a way to release the effects and the stories from your system and your experiences. So, and it takes time, it takes practice, and it takes doing it continuously. And to be engaged in that and be committed to being engaged in that through the long term. Because every day that you're hearing these experiences, you're wearing it. And so you have to be able to find a way every day to release that and let it go. And so I think what we're finding more and more is finding more ways of doing these through body techniques that are, kind of these mind-body experiential techniques to actually rid your system, rid your nervous system of these things. And that's sort of like where the field is going in terms of helping support people. I'm going to talk a little bit about a few of those, and maybe that's a starting point. But to sort of acknowledge the fact that for the most part, and I do agree with you. For the most part, the answer is always like mindfulness, and that's not always like that is helpful. That is absolutely helpful. But there are other ways to like engage in those mindfulness techniques that allow the system to actually purge. And those take dedicated time and effort over the course of, being in practice with that every single day. And Juan adds, we need to debrief constantly. On a regular basis, staff development meetings. It does take a toll. So in addition to the individual things that you can do, thank you, Juan, for bringing this up, that it's really important as a team and as an organization to have these outlets to talk to each other and have a place of release. I'll just stop there because I think you're going to add something else, Shalom?
No.
Okay.
I wanted to add something.
Yes.
This is Lola Rockwell Brown. The compassion fatigue really resonated with me because the work I do is, oftentimes traumatic and chaotic, day in and day out. At a certain point, I don't think I realized it, but I just kind of drew back my feelings and was like, okay, there's a job that has to be done, and I can't, weep over every single person, right? And take in all of the pain and suffering that's happening around me. And so that was okay for a time, but I think I stayed there too long. And it wasn't until I had to 5150 a 27-year-old. And it re-woke up my emotions. It reconnected me to feelings. And it was so traumatizing for me. I mean, I felt it in my body for a couple of days. It just was so hurtful, for many reasons. They were young, and, were my children's age. And it was just so much suffering is going on. And I was emotionally and mentally exhausted from that whole experience, but it has reset me now. If that makes sense. I've been reset, and I'm much more in tune with how I feel, and then the feelings of others. And it's also caused me to kick to kick up my self-care.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I mean, you know, you bring up the point that we're human, we're going to feel too, right? And so it's impossible not to get drawn into and feel something for the people that we're caring for, especially if they're reminders of like people in our own lives, like you mentioned, like your, you know, it's just like your own children's age. And so you have to feel in order to be compassionate. And also, I love how you kind of drew that in and said, hey, you know, I'm aware that I'm feeling something. And that's really the key, is that being self-aware of what you're feeling in the moment and as an after effect. So we've been talking about how, you know, trauma has these different E's, right? The event, the experience, and the effect. You also, as caring professionals, need to be aware of what is the event, what's the experience, and what's the effect of these things. And calling that out for yourself as an awareness point, and then knowing that, you know, you need to do something for yourselves to rid of that experience and that effect. And if that means, you know, engaging with your self-care, that's so important. If that means like, you know, encouraging your groups, your teams, your organizations to have more time with each other to debrief, that's important. If it means spending more time on, you know, with your family or with friends or colleagues, that's important. If it means, you know, whatever it might mean to you, to have the space to let that go in a way, right? And that's the real key to a lot of this. Thank you for sharing that, that story. Okay, I'm going to move us on because I'm actually, my favorite part of talking about trauma-informed care is actually doing some of the experiential exercises, and I want to get there. So let me get us through brain development and trauma, and then move into some of the things that we can do to help support ourselves and other people. So just to, and this might be a reminder to many of you, but also to say that we have changeable brains, right? So as our brains are developing early in life, they're actually developing at an explosive rate. And in the first years of life, especially, the different influences that take place have an effect on the brain. So they can affect our brains in both positive and negative ways. So while all experiences change the brain, not all experiences have an equal impact on the brain. However, what we know is that early traumatic experiences actually shape the development of the brain, and then people find ways to cope, thrive, survive, etc. This slide is just to share that the different regions of the brain function in different ways. So the bottom part of the brain controls more of what's called the simple functions, though they're not that simple, right? These are kind of our survival functions like respiration, heart rate, etc. The top areas of the brain control more of the complex functions like thinking, problem solving, regulating our emotions. However, what happens during development is that everything happens in an order. And so, for example, you know, we crawl before we walk, or we babble before we actually form words and talk. So at any point during that developmental process, if trauma or a traumatic experience plays a role, it stops the full development of that process from happening. So you can imagine, you know, for people that have experienced trauma in their lives, they might be a little bit more cognitively slow, or they might have to have more time processing information, or they might not be able to take noises or sensory information as strongly because their brain didn't have the opportunity to develop that function in full because of the early life trauma. I'm going to skip over this video, but the main takeaway from that video, and we don't have a whole lot of time to actually watch that video, but is this concept of toxic stress. So toxic stress is one that overwhelms the system. So there's actually different types of stress, right? There's positive stress, which is your everyday normal sorts of stress that are healthy parts of human development. But our bodies, especially with homeostasis in full function, allow our body to come back to normal, to a state of normal. So it's okay to have positive stresses in our lives. When we get to tolerable stress, we're looking at a higher level of activation of our bodies in alert system, if you will. And it's a time-limited experience. And really, the important part is that if it's buffered by supportive relationships, our brain then again has the ability to recover and adapt from whatever stress that might be. So, example of a tolerable stress might be like being injured or the loss of a loved one. So in most instances, people are able over time to move on and recover from those things, or function healthfully. And I'm using generalizations, but for the most case, people are able to overcome tolerable stress. Toxic stress is when we get to this place of constant activation of the stress response, and especially during sensitive periods like early childhood, and it has long-term changes to the body and the mind. So people who are in a toxically stressed situation or toxically stressed personalities, even exposures to minor stresses on a daily basis, end up being more stressed out, and therefore it increases this their feelings of physical and mental health conditions. Would you say that we are in a space of being toxically stressed now? Yeah, I'll answer that question for everyone, right? So currently our society and where we're at now in terms of the multiple changes that have had to take place just in this year, with coronavirus, COVID-19, with all of the violence that we're seeing, racism, the layers and impacts of many different things, the politics, the political environment, so many things. We are in a state of toxic stress, and just to be aware of that, because right now most people they're like, you know, a match that's just ready to light up, right? Because of this societal state of toxic stress. I just saw in addition, yeah, having climate crisis happen as well adds to toxic stress. So I want to talk about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or the ACEs study. And so this was a study that was done with about 17,000 individuals. And it was a Kaiser Permanente study that looked at the effects that people have early in life and how that plays a role or an impact for people later in life. Out of this study came a mechanism by which to assess people for the different types of stresses or stressors or trauma experiences that people have had throughout the course of their life. So one of the outcomes of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study was to show that the more types of ACEs that people have has a greater impact on biological and health risks or functions, and then leads to more serious or long-term consequences for physical health, mental health, functioning, risk-taking, risky behaviors, and even spiritual health. And here you have a list of different types of things that the ACEs study found in terms of health and social outcomes. So just take a look at this list. These are some of the health and social outcomes that were pointed out from the ACE study. A lot of these are results of course, trauma from early life, and they're linked to physical health conditions like, but diabetes, heart disease, gastrointestinal problems. And just pointing out, like in the left-hand column over here, the top left-hand column, we see a list of behaviors. And we can probably add to this list. And to recognize that these are coping mechanisms, right? So coping mechanisms that people have engaged in and used to soothe pain or the experiences that they've endured. Okay, so the purpose of the ACEs study was to sort of show, excuse me, not the purpose, the outcome of the ACEs study was to show that as the ACEs score increases, risk increases. And ACEs don't occur alone. So if one has one ACE, there's an 87% chance that a person will have 2 or more ACEs. So for the most part, most people have more than one ACE. And I heard a statistic within the last year that for the people that we work with in the community health level and all the people that you work with, ACEs are actually more likely to be in the upper teens, right? So we're looking at an ACE score of, to like 14 to 18, if you will, where the average population has about anywhere from 4 to 6 ACEs, let's say. Our populations have much, much higher rates of ACEs. So what does that mean? This is actually kind of a difficult slide to think about, but people with 6 or more ACEs on average have a risk of early death at 20 years earlier than those with less ACEs, without ACEs, right? So the range of life can be impacted as much as 20 years, depending on how high that ACE score is. And when I saw this slide, it sort of took me aback. So thinking about like how common ACEs are and the fact that many people are dying earlier because of early childhood trauma or trauma at any time, really. And so people who've experienced trauma can have a multitude of things that happen, right? The effects and the impact can be many. So this slide sort of gives you an example, some examples of how this plays out for different people. And I'm just going to take a pause here and ask you, what surprises you? What jumps out at you here? Or are these things not surprising? And are these things that you see within the clients that you work with? How true are all of these? Yeah, so for some it's not surprising, and for others, yeah, this statistic of 15 times more likely to die by suicide. All are true, not surprising. Impulsivity and wanting to get a quick fix. Yeah. Yeah. So more traumas like to recur as a result of all of the above. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. So even though people might engage in some of these behaviors and or coping mechanisms, more trauma can come from the exposure to or the experience of these as well. People might be more prone to violent behavior. Yeah, so you feel like more clients are ready to give up. Yeah. And then, yeah, rates for suicide attempts, that's likely to be higher, right? So what we have here is the rate of more likely to die by suicide, but to attempting is likely to be higher. And all of this leads to a cycle of repetitiveness. Yeah, absolutely. So I know that we've been talking kind of about the dire situation that trauma and the trauma experience can have. And while that's true, I want to move into a place of hope, which is that our brains are changeable. We have this ability called neuroplasticity. So they can change and they can adapt based on experiences, environments, people in our lives, having supportive relationships, and through mind-body approaches. So that's where I want to take us next, is to talk about the different ways that we can interact with people to help support them. And let me just introduce you to the trauma continuum. This is by way of a way that we'll be talking about how to engage with folks and with your own selves to help support your own health and self-care. So we can divide the way that people react into these three categories: shock, trauma, or stress. And really, not that you need to know the ins and outs of all of these elements, but within each of these categories, there's a part of the brain that gets activated. There's a part of the nervous system that gets activated. Then there's a stress response, the fight, flight, or freeze response, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. And then there's an orientation to time. So in a shock state, people are in a dissociated state. In a trauma state, people are both past and present. So there's a duality here. So people who are experiencing trauma might, physically be in the present, but their mind and their experience is in the past, right? So when people hear voices or smell sounds, or smell things, or hear sounds, or images come their way, they immediately go into the past. And so that's the important point of the trauma experience, is that people are living in this duality of past present. And then in the stress space, people are living in the present. So keep those in mind, because we're going to talk about different interventions that help people based on these categories. And our responses to any of these, shock, trauma, or stress, are generally falling in these three categories: fight, flight, or freezing. And as you know, when people experience trauma in any way, shape, or form, their body, in a natural state, their brain signals the body to respond to that perceived threat. And so they go into one of these states. Ordinarily, when the threat goes away, people go back to baseline. But if there's an ongoing threat, then the body never goes back into that state of baseline. They're stuck in an on position, if you will, and that's the stress response. So if we break this down into fight, flight, or freeze, let's talk about kind of the impacts that happen on the system, if you will. So name some things that happen in the fight mode. When people are in fight mode, what happens to them? What's going on in their body? What's going on in their systems? Aggression, adrenaline, tension, heat. Yep, great. Stress, absolutely. Anger, so the emotions coming out. Yep, so you got them. So it's more of this tightness. There's shallow, rapid breathing. People might have their hands on their fists. They're grinding their teeth. They want to actually act out, if you will. They're feeling anger, rage, tense. They might be crying. There might also be some knots in the stomach. And Body temperature might rise. We saw that. Blood pressure spikes, absolutely. How about in flight mode? What are we seeing in flight? How do people react in flight mode? Fear, running, being disengaged, avoidance. Yep. Oops. Okay. So in flight mode, we're seeing more of the wanting to run from life. We see rapid movement, restless legs, maybe numbness. There's more shallow breathing. We might see big darting eyes. People might be, engaged in like excessive exercise in this one too. There's feelings of denial, embarrassment. Yes, all those things. And then in freeze mode, I'll just pull this up so that you can see the difference here. People are feeling more stuck, right? So there's actually a sense of being frozen, cold, numb, stiff, heavy. People are more likely to hold their breath. They hold a sense of dread, if you will. We might see decreased heart rate and just an orientation to some threat, being constantly on because of that threat, but in that frozen perspective. So we're gonna, and I want you to hold on to these because we're gonna talk about different ways that we can work with people, but I want to move us into the side of how we can do post-traumatic growth, resilience, and healing. And when we think about resilience, resilience is the ability of individuals, families, communities, groups to cope with adversity and trauma and to adapt. And resilience is promoted by supportive relationships through connection, through adaptive skills, even cultures, traditions that tend to hold on to hope from the perspective of hope and change and adaptation. I love this image here that I found about the coronavirus. This is actually a mural that was painted in Oakland. The coronavirus is a wake-up call. It's our chance to build a new and loving society. And I do believe that's true. So that's an example of resilience. And I'm sure a lot of you can share other examples of resilience that you've seen. So healing from trauma is like healing from a physical injury, right? It's a natural human process. And just like physical injuries, healing from trauma can take time, but it is possible. And there are ways that we can help support ourselves as well as the people that we work with through healing capacities. Okay, so this comes from the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council, who came up with this concept of rapid post-traumatic recovery, meaning that when we are working with someone who we hear trauma stories or find that there is a trauma background, which is virtually everyone, quite frankly, that there are ways to support people through these aspects that allows people to recover from trauma in a more rapid fashion. So the elements of rapid post-traumatic recovery is that fundamentally healing happens in the context of relationships, so that we maximize the sense of collaboration and the sense of empowerment. We work from a shared power and shared decision making, as opposed to a hierarchical, like, let me fix you. It's more of an equal sharing, equal power, if you will. And that having a supportive and consistent person in a person's life, and that might be you, right? Depending on what your role is, you might be that helping professional that helps a person. Could be also like a mentor, a teacher, a coach, a family member, but having a relational person to connect with is key. And so I bring that to you, right, for your own self-care, as well as for the people that you work with, encouraging people to identify someone who's supportive and consistent. And then the use of internal resources. So again, the younger the brain, the more likely the changeable the brain is, but the brain can be changeable at any point of life. But we work from a strengths-based perspective and encouraging people to use and tap into their own internal resources. So that's how rapid post-traumatic recovery looks. And then as an ongoing basis, as far as post-traumatic post-traumatic growth goes, these are some other important things. Having an established sanctuary that might look like a home, that might look just like, a place where a person feels comfortable. It's going to be up to each individual. Having the resources, having ongoing case management, giving the person permission to disclose what they're feeling. So remember, we talked about how shame and humiliation is often a universal response to trauma. So when we come from the perspective of letting people know that we see and we hear them and offering that empathy and validation, it is the key to allowing people to grow beyond the traumatic experience. So you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. We can just encourage people to talk and hold the space and be supportive. You don't have to have all the answers. And I want to make that point clear because I think a lot of us who work in the field and hear the trauma stories that we do, we feel like we have to have answers. And, to encourage yourself to release yourself from that, because just by holding space and listening is enough sometimes. So what does that look like, right? In terms of trauma-informed care, this might be how a dialogue would run, right? So how can I support you where you are now? Just asking the question. When the trauma story might leave you speechless, right? I'm specifically calling out those of you that mentioned and feel like these are overwhelming situations. Just be willing to sit in supportive silence and then connect people to the resources and providing clear information about that. Also keeping in mind that you might have to repeat information several times because, for people that have overwhelmed or overworked nervous systems, processing information can be often a little bit difficult. So remembering to slow down, not only for yourself, but for the other person, helps dramatically. And to take this a little bit further in terms of how we encourage people to feel safe and to feel grounded is the validating concepts, right? Remembering to say, what happened was not your fault, you're not to blame, thank you for trusting me, and then, you deserve the help that you need now. What are some other ways that you have found to help support people through words, through validation, through conversation? What can you add here? Resilience is present, in close-knit encampment families, yeah. So that's the relational aspect, right? And we honor that and encourage people to continue to engage with people around them in their encampments as a way of support. We might say something like, I can understand why you're feeling stressed. Yep. Opening your heart, your mind, and meaning it. Walking the talk, sure. Yeah. Understanding frustration. Yeah, letting them know they're heard, they're known, they're seen. I think that's the biggest thing, letting people know that I see you and I hear you. Great. So just a few more things about how to support someone who's experienced trauma. You've mentioned a lot of these, and I just want to highlight a few more, which is allowing the space, allowing the time for the person to get to a state of calm, regulating their emotions. All of that might take a little bit longer. Being predictable. When people are trauma survivors, people who have trauma stories in their background, they need to know what's happening, right? They need things to be predictable. So to the extent that you can share with them, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm about to do, and sort of setting the agenda, if you will, for what is to happen so that people are aware. You've mentioned a lot of these already, but the type of support that you give is kind, loving, patient, empathic, through an empowerment perspective, giving people choice. What is a big trigger for a lot of folks is when they don't feel like they have been given the choice or control over what might happen to them. So collaboration, cooperation, meeting people on an equal footing is absolutely key. Great. So I'm going to take us back to this trauma continuum here and talk about the different ways that we can work with people based on where they're at in the shock, trauma, or stress scenario. So, and I'm going to break this down for us, but basically to say that people who are in a shock state are in that freeze mode. So we want to find ways to re-embody, help them re-embody themselves. In a trauma state, people are in fight or flight, so we want to find a way to stop adrenaline. And then in a stress mode, people are still present, but they're disengaged. So we want to find ways to continue to engage them. So shock interventions, avoiding anything overly mental or overly analytical. Bringing attention to the present time and place, slowing down speech, using comforting words and voice. If any of you work with children, often children like to be, you can sing or hum to, and that helps bring a person into the present time and place. And then I'm going to walk through a few experiential embodiment exercises that you can do for yourselves or for your clients. So remember, people in a shock state are in this place of freezing, right? So they're like, if any of you have ever seen an opossum in nature, opossums are like experts at freezing, right? When they see a predator, they immediately freeze and then act as if they're dead. That's kind of what shock is. So what we want to do with people is to give them a way to come back into the present moment, re-embody themselves. So this is a really great exercise. It's called the 4-3-2-1 exercise. And you ask people to name 4 things that they see, 3 things that they hear, 2 things that you smell, and 1 thing that you feel. And we end on the feeling because we want them to name an emotion at the end, right? Because the emotion is what allows the person to actually sit back in their bodies. So they can describe, like, I'm feeling a lot of anger right now. Okay, let's talk about that anger, right? Or I'm feeling a lot of fear. Okay, tell me what's making you fearful. Right, so after you go through the 4-3-2-1 exercise, you're taking them through basically these senses, and then you end in an emotion, and then allow them to expand on that emotion. And you might do that through open-ended exercises. Okay, so here's another one, and I want you to be able to maybe even try this out for yourselves. And so this one is, and for any of you that know me, I actually believe and I coach on mind-body experiential exercises. So I'm bringing in a lot of those into our time here together, because my feeling is that, you know, I want you as helping professionals to have ways to support yourselves, but also to engage and coach others on how they can help support themselves. So this is called Jin Shing Holds, and this is a Japanese form of healing where we work with the different body parts to harmonize and work through feelings. It's similar to acupressure, but basically what you're doing here is holding. And so this one works through the hand. And if you see on the slide here, your hand, each finger on your hand holds different emotions, right? So you may have gone through this exercise, this 4-3-2-1 exercise, and you've landed on a feeling or an emotion. So someone is telling you, I'm feeling really worried. So then you can guide folks to hold the different fingers, hold the different parts of their body to help heal, ground, and alleviate the pressure there. So for someone who's worried, they will hold their thumb. For someone who's feeling fear, they're going to hold their index finger, their pointer finger. Anger is in the middle finger. Feeling sadness or grief is in the ring finger. Feeling nervousness, tension, anxiety is in the pinky. And then in general, the palm is where happiness is, right? So you can follow any of these with just sort of holding the center of the palm. So in the moment healing, remember we're in shock state and we're trying to get people centered and bringing them back to the present moment. So these are two ways that you can do that. All right, so trauma interventions. So this is the middle part of the column. And when people are in trauma, they're in that fight or flight. So we want to use tools that are trauma specific, that can, and they're also, people in trauma are in that past present duality. So we want to bring people back into the present again, just a little bit similar to shock, and use our empathy, validating, and reframing tools and skills. So this is a really beautiful technique that I encourage you to try right now as we're talking. This is called the butterfly hug. And here's some images of people using the butterfly hug. This, for any of you that may know about EMDR or have experienced EMDR, this is a common tool that's used in EMDR, because when people are experiencing and working through the trauma in the moment, we coach people in EMDR to use this butterfly hug. But regardless of therapy, this is a technique that's used around the world in all types of trauma, war-torn situations, refugee situations. Inner city youth are being taught this, young children, all across the world. And it's very simply to put your hands in a butterfly position, as you see in this left side over here, and then to put them against your chest. So in that butterfly position, your hands are in, your thumbs are crossed over, and you put your hands on your chest. If that is not comfortable, people can actually hold both sides of their body, both of their arms, in a cross position. And you tap back and forth. So you go from left to right, left, right, and just tap back and forth. And as you're doing this, you're just breathing through. This example on the slide says to tap for 10 counts and then take a breath. There is no necessarily a particular count that you need to follow, but as you're tapping, just continuing to breathe. What this is it's a way to bring in what we call bilateral function, which brings in that parasympathetic nervous system side of the body that wants to be in a state of calm. So as we tap the right, tap the left, tap the right, tap the left, we're actually building in this connection from left to right in the body. And that's essentially what the butterfly hug is meant to do. So a way to calm and soothe in the moment when a person is feeling unsafe, scared, worried, fearful, trauma. just engaging in the butterfly hug. You can do this for yourself, and you can encourage other people, teach other people how to do it as well. And people can continue to do it and also talk through whatever they're going through at the same time. Because while that bilateral function is going on, it's also bringing down the nervous system. There's also a script that can go along with it. Like if you see on the slide here, you can close your eyes, imagine a safe place, and then describe that safe place while you're doing the tapping or the butterfly hugs. Okay, so stress intervention. So remember, in a state of stress, people are still in the present moment, but they're just sort of a little bit disengaged. So we want to find ways to engage a person to the best of their ability. So we do this through body language, through the use of nonverbals, eye contact, deep listening, reflective listening. Only in stress are we able to get to a place of problem solving and coping. So when a person is in a state of shock or a state of trauma, active shock or active trauma, typically problem solving and coping is not always going to be most effective because people are just not in the present space. But when they are in that present space, and we know that this is sort of that toxic stress situation, we can get into a mode of problem solving. And this is where you're going to use those calming techniques for yourself and for other people. So calming, as I know many of you are well aware, is a way of bringing down the heightened sense of the nervous system. However, when you're working with someone, is to first calm yourself and then to calm the other person. Because when we regulate ourselves, it allows the other person to regulate as well, and we call that co-regulation. So use that as self-care for yourselves in the moment, as well as a way to calm others into their present state. So again, for people that are in that stressed out functionality, calming techniques and grounding techniques are going to be super helpful. Here is an example of a calming technique that I really love. It's called the rainbow breathing technique. And I'm going to walk you through this. So if you will take a moment, just wherever you're at, to just sit back, putting your hands by your sides, taking a few deep breaths inwards as you're settling into wherever you are, feeling the ground, feeling the chair beneath you. And start to imagine a rainbow. So this exercise is called rainbow breathing. Imagining the colors of the rainbow, going from the outside to the inside. We have red, orange, yellow, green, light blue, dark blue, and purple. And just imagine those colors. And as I call out each color, for each color, take a deep breath in and envision the color inside of you and expanding into your body parts. So bring to mind the image of red. Thinking about the red inside of yourselves and allowing it to expand into your body parts. And then breathing out, and as you're breathing out, breathe out the color and imagine negative thoughts, worries, and stress leaving your body. And then we breathe in the color orange. Wherever it shows up in your body, expanding the color to the external parts of your body, and then breathing out and letting go of whatever the orange might stand for. Breathing in yellow, expanding into your body, into all of your parts, your organ systems, and then breathing out the yellow and the worries and the thoughts that come with that. Breathing in the color green, wherever green shows up for you, allowing that to expand and exhaling it out. Moving into blue, light blue, breathing in light blue, allowing the color to expand all of your body parts and letting it out. Into dark blue or indigo, envisioning that color as it expands into the far reaches of your body, and then letting it go along with the stress. And then finally, the color purple, wherever that might be for you, expanding that color purple to the far edges of your body, maybe just outside of your body itself, and then breathing it out. Taking a few more deep breaths as you come back to the present moment. If you've closed your eyes, you may open your eyes and just noticing how you feel. And you can repeat this rainbow as many times as you need in the moment, or when you're in the breathing technique itself, is just continuing with the rainbow colors. So really, really powerful breathing technique. I know there are many, but this one I particularly like because identifying with colors helps to calm the insides and the parts of the body and helps to relieve emotions. Most people can identify colors with an emotional state. Red being kind of that hot, angry, heated color, down to purple, blues and purples, which are more of the cooling colors, helps bring down that nervous system. All right, so if you've experienced that, I hope that you are feeling in a more calm state now. And thank you for engaging with that with me. And just to bring in other healing modalities that you can use for yourself and for others, connecting with trauma resources, identifying counselors that specialize in trauma-specific interventions, thinking about different ways to engage in movement with the body, music, dance, expressive arts, creative arts, maybe even mindfulness or yoga classes that are accessible and affordable. There are so many right now, actually, since COVID has, since March. The online ability to access different classes is just booming right now. You can also refer to other healing practitioners or professionals or cultural practices, and to identify ways of peer support. I love that someone mentioned the idea of family being part of the encampments that people live in. And so other types of peers that people can engage in and have that peer support. Now, I know we have just a few minutes left, and I just want to walk us through a few of the principles of trauma-informed care from an organizational perspective. And I give you this just to think about in terms of where you work, where your organizations are at, in terms of their approach to trauma and trauma-informed care. And how we can think about maybe engaging in a different way to bring about trauma and trauma-informed care. I'm just reading the chat function. Great. So I'm so glad that that exercise was helpful for you for stress relief, and it's something that you can use in the future. Okay, so trauma-informed care. We've been talking a lot about trauma, but just to sort of put out there, what is trauma-informed care in itself? Well, it's organizational change and a change in organizational culture, which really understands the pervasive nature of trauma and works at different levels, individual level, the organizational level, and the systematic level, to shift the way that we engage with people who have experienced trauma and with helping professionals who are helping people who have experienced trauma. So it actually comes from the strengths-based perspective and encourages a strengths-based delivery approach. These are the principles of trauma-informed care. And you can take a look at them. There's 6 basic principles, but I like to think about this as kind of a movement from doing to others to doing for others to actually doing with others. So all of what we do moves from this hierarchical, let me tell you what to do, to this place of, let me work with you. Let me be here with you. Let me walk with you as you're going through what you're going through. That's the essence of trauma-informed care, and for an organization to take on that perspective. There's also what's called the 4 R's. So for organizations to come from this perspective of realizing the widespread prevalence, recognizing how trauma impacts communities, responding in certain ways that carry that empathy, understanding, and to resist re-traumatizing. So having policies, practices, and systems that don't re-traumatize. So what does this mean? For you, this means moving from this paradigm of what's wrong with you, which is very victim blaming and shaming, to what happened, right? Tell me your story, tell me your experience, tell me your narrative. And coming from that strengths perspective. So not only what happened, but how do you feel? And what resources do you have to cope and to help yourself? And we walk people through that sense of protection and that sense of hope. And we go from the old way of thinking, which was very deficit-based, to the language of strengths-based. And I think Juan may have brought this up earlier in the training. The way that we use language, we want to shift our language from being very harmful and victimizing to a place of understanding, to understanding that people are trying to get their needs met, they're trying to connect, they have survival skills, they want to learn, they want to cope, and then giving people that opportunity. And finally, that we think about organizations moving from trauma organized, which is more reactive, this us versus them, this authoritarian leadership perspective, to trauma informed, which is sort of where we're speaking of now, the nature, understanding the nature, the impact, including disparities and inequities, and changing the language, to healing, which is more collaborative, respectful, reflective, relational. So we might call this going from a trauma inducing to trauma reducing. And so I ask you, as we're ending this, to think about, where do you feel your organization lies? Right? And I know we are just at time, so just sort of think about to yourself, where would you call your organization now? And what would it take to move up a notch, if you will? So if you're at trauma organized, how can your organization become more trauma informed? If you're at a trauma informed place, how can it be moved a notch up to being a healing organization? Excuse me. And so just thinking about that as we end, I'm open to hearing your thoughts. And for those of you that may need to leave, I just wanted to thank you for your time and open up for any questions. Oh, excuse me while I have a little tickle in my throat. So thank you for being here and for participating. I hope this was helpful.